Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's SASIG webinar, Defending the Future, a masterclass in breach resilience, something I've really been looking forward to today. We've got Conor Hogan and Stephen Scott with us today, both from BSI, and you can see their job titles there, and also their lovely, lovely personages. Next slide, please. So I'm Peter Word, partner at Naturally Cyber. You may have heard me here before as a guest chair. I have to declare an interest in today's webinar. I've been involved with BSI since the early 1990s, particularly on the information security front. I remember when BS 7799 was first launched, and I'm always interested to hear what BSI have got to say. Next slide, please. As always, a massive thank you to all of our supporters, without whom these events would not be able to take place. And you'll notice one of our key supporters there is, of course, BSI. So thank you to them today as well. Next slide, please. By the way, if you hear a lot of barking in the background while I'm presenting, it'll only be at the beginning of the webinar, and it's a couple of very enthusiastic greyhounds in the garden here. Okay, so what's up and coming? Let's look at the next few webinars we've got. On Monday, we've got learning from SRM's latest Cyber Insights report. It says here, hear about the latest threat trends from the frontline IR, that's incident response experts, and learn how to avoid IR pitfalls. Good stuff. On Wednesday, why even the strongest SOC cannot defend you from your most vulnerable supplier. One of my favorite topics, I'm guessing here, supply chain. Discover the best practices and considerations for building a powerful defense against evolving threats. Friday, why am I failing to engage my workforce in cybersecurity training? My goodness me, that's a popular topic, isn't it? Something that we've been talking about, well, in my world for 30 years, probably. So explore digitalization. Sorry, wrong thing. Discover how to overcome information overload and the demands of modern work life with simple and personalized experiences. That sounds excellent. I am such a fan of personalizing any form of cybersecurity training and education. Lastly, on next Monday, move fast and break down query, innovation and security in energy infrastructures. So looking at digitalization in the energy industry, how legacy and innovative technologies interact, and why those responsible for safety and security are pushing back. And absolutely anything in the OT environment is always interesting. The concepts are very different than those of us in traditional IT. So well worth a view there too, I think. Next slide, please. The in-person events. Apply now. Guildford in-person and live stream on Wednesday, the 24th of January. The future of AI in cybersecurity. Trends, threats and resilience. We'll be looking at that in a bit more detail in a moment, I think. London on Thursday, 25th of January, SASIG Thought Leadership, looking to 2024 and beyond. Definitely an event not to miss. That's both in person and live stream, as all these first three are. So if you can't get a place in person, you can still view online. Chelmsford on 31st of January, Eastern SASIG. That means Eastern UK, not somewhere in the far frozen East. Fostering trust and defending businesses from cybercrime. And then lastly, in Milton Keynes on the 13th of Feb, we've got the future of AI, friend or foe. AI really is the topic of the moment, isn't it, guys? Next slide, please. And yeah, just looking in more detail at that particular event, 13th of February, the future of AI. This is in person at Milton Keynes, and you'll see BSI here again. There's the full agenda for the day. And as SASIG says, we're proud to invite members to this event about all aspects of artificial intelligence, talking about how AI can be a powerful ally in safeguarding your assets and addressing modern risk management challenges. So you can register, of course, to attend now at thesasig.com/events. An event not to miss, I might suggest, and plenty of time to book now, ready for the 13th of February. Next slide, please. Big SASIG. Yes, of course. Don't forget our flagship conference on the 23rd of April. As you undoubtedly know, Big SASIG is where cybersecurity end users and vendors have always come together as equals. It's not a sales pitch, it's an opportunity to meet and discuss needs, talk about new projects, and learn from each other. There will be, as always, industry-leading partners, world-class workshops, and a full day of building really useful, genuine connections. Definitely an event not to miss. That's 23rd of April in London. Next slide, please. On the same topic, we need your help. If you haven't done this already, what we're looking for is from you, our audience, to tell us at SASIG your partner nominations. So those that would benefit from the exposure Big SASIG can bring. So if you've got partner organizations, vendors you trust, really love, and believe others would benefit from, email martin@thesasig.com with your nominations so that they can be invited to take part in Big SASIG. Next slide. Social media, as always. Find out more about SASIG on the website. You can see the upcoming events. You can view, as a member, you can view previous recordings of webinars and so on. And stay updated, as always, on LinkedIn and on X, aka the site formerly known as Twitter, at SASIG Events. House rules, as ever. Although we can't strictly enforce the Chatham House rule online like we do for physical meetings, please remember to respect both our speakers and our questioners and not to attribute anything by company name or individual. During the webinar, you can feel free, and please do, ask questions and make comments as always. At the bottom of the screen, you can select chat, which will bring up the chat window amazingly. Make sure you remember to choose to everyone, not to hosts and panelists, if you want everyone to see your comments or to hear your questions. If you want to come onto the webinar live, you can use the raise hand option and we'll bring you in to voice a question. And lastly, you can use the Q&A to raise a question in text form that the presenters will answer at the end of the session. Don't forget, as I mentioned earlier, webinar recordings are always available on the website, so you can share your invitation with other colleagues and they can watch the event later. We also, of course, would encourage you to spread the word, not just within your organization, but to other organizations that you know and are friends with, to make sure they don't miss out on some of the great SASIG webinars and other events. Don't forget, we need your feedback, including suggestions for future webinars. And if you're feeling brave, you can volunteer to contribute yourself with a webinar in the future. Re-emphasizing this, not just your feedback, but at the poll at the end of today's webinar, you can opt in to hear more from Conor, Stephen, and BSI. So if you find today interesting, and you will, I'm sure, then you can get more information from our friends at BSI just by opting in on that end of webinar poll. Okay, you'll be relieved to hear it's time for me to shut up, and I'm going to pass the baton now to our friends from BSI and let them take over and present to you their feelings on AI. Thank you, guys.
No problem. Cheers, Peter. And Conor, I think you're going to throw up the slides. And
yep, there we go. Thank you very much, Peter. Over to you, Stephen.
Yeah, cool. So look, great intro there, Peter. Myself and Conor are going to spend the next, I think, approximately 40 minutes kind of going through going through our suggested approach for building a framework around breach resilience. We're going to give a quick intro into ourselves and our history. We'll delve into a few challenges, which I'm kind of looking forward to talking about. we've a 10-step framework that we're going to go through. So hopefully that's a takeaway for everyone on the call. And that's kind of the most important thing. If I go on a webinar, I want something that I can actually take with me after and see if I could implement it in my own company. And then we'll summarize in some final thoughts, some key kind of enablers that we want to go through. So yeah, really quick intro of myself. Stephen Scott. I work as one of the practice directors in BSI Digital Trust, with the company on and off for about 11 years. My mix of experience is, luckily, actually kind of being blessed to some extent, has been a split of industry, mostly in the financial services sector. I've worked in 3 different banks. I really found that to be beneficial, because it gave me that good solid baseline for what good looks like. I know some people might be laughing to say financial industry might be that way, but I think it's so heavily regulated, it drives good behavior. And then about 11 years in consulting, so getting that breadth of experience. I'm more from the security side, okay? So that's where I want to kind of flavor it. We're coming from 2 different angles at this webinar. I'm a former QSA, so credit card security. I like a bit of risk, a bit of governance, and unfortunately have a lot of auditor hats on over the past. So a lot of people have maybe walked to the other side of the road when they see me. I don't think I've ever been in a popular job. So look, that's me at a very high level. I'll pass you over to the more suave Conor, as you can see from his photo there. Give a quick intro.
Thanks, Stephen. And just picking up on the fact that we're coming at this webinar from 2 very different but aligned perspectives. I am a career consultant. I've been working with organizations in the financial services sector, in the public sector, in the technology sector, and right up and down multiple different verticals, including energy and transport, for my entire career. I am a reformed auditor, perhaps, as well, with an awful lot of experience in proactive advisory, including IT audit, statutory audits for under IFRS and other related international certification requirements as well. Today, I spend an awful lot of my time working in the world of privacy, data protection, and increasingly AI and AI ethics. And currently I lead the practice of privacy professionals in BSI Digital Trust, leading out on our outsourced DPO services. And breaches are something that we come across day in and day out. But as Stephen said, hopefully I'll be able to lend a slightly different perspective than maybe than Stephen's more information security, cyber background. And yeah, we work closely together. We're sort of sides of the same coin. We happen to come from the same part of Ireland, and we're really looking forward to sharing our perspectives on breach resilience, and as Stephen said, the framework that we believe organizations should consider as they move towards resilience in breaches rather than reactive strategies to respond.
We considered putting on subtitles as well, due to our coming from Wexford in Ireland, but hopefully everyone can hear us loud and clear.
And as Peter said in his introduction, BSI is a long-standing supporter and sponsor of SASIG, and many people will probably know who BSI is. Both Stephen and I come from the consulting services arm of the global professional services firm BSI, and the digital trust consulting business really focuses on empowering organizations in data to manage risk and to build, design, maintain, and then evidence digital trust in today's digital era. We're specifically tasked with providing cyber risk advisory, security testing, data governance, privacy, and advisory services around emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, industrial security, IoT, and advanced attack simulation and red teaming engagements for our clients. Our global expertise enables us to provide services that enable our clients to better respond to cyber threats and build more effective resilience. And we're really looking forward to this conversation today. We again encourage questions and anecdotes or insights from the shared audience that we have today, because as I mentioned, in essence, our aim is to try and enable our clients to design and build to evidence and then maintain digital trust. And I think one of the best ways that we can contribute to that conversation is by having that conversation in forums such as this. So thank you to Sasi for having us today, and let's get cracking. Stephen, maybe just to kick things off, thinking about your experience throughout your career, both in industry and indeed in consulting, what do you think, or what do you consider to be the biggest hindrances to success for an organization when it comes to the challenge of resilience?
Yeah, it's a fair question. And obviously, there'd be no good webinar without a little bit of pre-planning. So I got an opportunity to kind of think about this question. It's difficult, right? Because being I suppose as a consultant, you get that luxury of kind of going into a variety of different environments and different industries, and it gives you that insight into, well, what's kind of happening, what are the negatives, what are the positives, and what am I seeing as kind of like trends that go on across different types of organizations. I spoke actually at a medical conference about a year ago ish. My entire conversation was really on this specific topic. I'm quite passionate about it. I find the major thing that I've seen, which really is that hindrance to success, is like the inability of a business to balance growth ambitions, I suppose, while trying to maintain, utilizing the current capacity within the existing workforce. So I want to kind of explain what I mean by that. So hopefully this kind of resonates with people on the call here. It is safe to assume that we're all busy. Every single person, generally within a job, particularly I think since we moved more remote, we're flat to the mat. We are constantly working. You're getting hit from different angles. If I use the example of an IT department specifically, we do work with a lot of them. So this is where I've seen it most. Businesses are quite commercially ambitious. It's the nature of the world we live in. So, and change is inevitable, right? So people are always going to try change, grow, drive more revenue, make more sales, and push in the right direction. Particularly actually regulation and stuff like that, it enforces change as well. So it's not just commercial, it's depending on the ecosystem that you play in and a variety of different factors. But where I feel there's a real disconnect is, how does a company do that or adhere to that growth ambition or regulatory requirement without overburdening their existing workforce? So you will see in a lot of examples, you've got projects that are being driven because it's flavor of the month, or something is happening and I need to move in this specific direction. And they come up with a business requirements document, technical spec, functional spec, and there's a project manager assigned. And what happens then is, where I find is, particularly from a security perspective and or a privacy or data governance perspective, there is a lack of insight into the quantification of required effort to support that project through its entire life cycle. So what happens is, you've got your second line defense functions who are there, sitting there, attending cabs, reviewing project documentation, and a variety of different factors. But there is a disconnect again in how much time they're being drawn upon to actually support that project.
So is it a capacity issue?
I think it's a lack of understanding the impact of capacity, or the capacity requirements for a specific ask. It might be actually being naive or actually ignorant to the fact of what that is. But I think if you're developing the business requirements document, Conor, right, there should be a portion of that where you are putting a lot of effort into determining what the estimated requirements are for IT. So if you're bringing on a new system, can I do it with my current workforce, right? Because you're going to have to support, patch, manage that system, do whatever there's going to be additional pen testing. You might need to do a DPIA on it. So I always find there's two repercussions that come from that, right? If you think about,
There's also the skills requirement, right, in the current workforce, and whether you actually
yeah,
have not just the capacity within the existing workforce, but actually the skills that are going to be required, because it could be new technologies. And obviously,
that's very, I agree with that.
we've discussed a couple of times already the advent of artificial intelligence now, and the reliance that an awful lot of organizations, whether knowingly or not, will have and possibly already have on AI powered tools. And so the skills and the technologies, or rather the skills and competencies required to support newer and evolving technologies may not be there.
Yeah, and I just think the last point I have on that for me is like there's a repercussion to that problem. Okay, so it's either, if you think of it like a balloon, the balloon's either going to pop because people are burnt out, or secondly, deadlines get moved out, right? So neither of which are desirable. So I do think that for me is the key challenge, I think, to success. Maybe I'll just throw that back to you, Conor. Is there anything from your experience that kind of stops companies achieving?
Do you know, I think one thing that you mentioned there was around sort of the decision making, and it leads me to think about accountability, that organizations think they are doing the right thing by launching projects, and you know, where you have even business requirements documentation, technical specs, functional specs, that's all great, right? But actually, what's the overarching decision-making authority? What's the governance of the organization actually directing? Where does the business want to go? What is the overarching strategy of the business? And what's the business trying to achieve? And ultimately, are all of the activities that the business is putting together from a technical solutions perspective, you know, opening up new markets, you know, growing the business, as you've said, but then is it supported by the change functions, so IT, the CAB, by information security, by the privacy function, and indeed, are they all aligned towards the same thing, and are they enabling each other? So for me, it always comes back to governance, and you know, that's a board challenge. That's the challenge that sits squarely on the at the desks of the chief executive officer and her colleagues. It is quite significant, because you need to govern and manage risk. And today's webinar is about breach resilience, and the framework that we're proposing is centered on risk without a shadow of a doubt, but actually its foundation is governance, and the board taking accountability for the decisions that it takes around infrastructure, around investment, around skills, around prioritizing the response capabilities, the response mechanisms, and the ability to give assurance. You mentioned the second line of defense, but also third line of defense, internal stakeholders across the business, and indeed external stakeholders, because it's more than just, you know, technical resilience or IT disaster recovery today.
Yeah.
Business resilience is squarely what we're talking about today, and the technical resilience of your organization to be able to detect, respond, mitigate a breach will directly impact your business's performances today. That digital threat that exists, or you know, amongst outside in the world of cyberspace, for want of a better term, the cyber threat landscape that exists today, it exists as a fundamental threat to the very existence of many organizations today. And the governance and accountability requirements to drive the improvements that are needed to be ready for that are continual. And so whether that's a data focus, whether it is an innovation focus, whether it is a security focus, or even if it's just the commercial focus of the business. So for me, it comes back to the accountability piece. And so maybe based on sort of the challenges that we've very loftily described, perhaps, Stephen, will we take the opportunity to go through this framework and through the approach of how we're proposing organizations need to look at that, and how in BSI today we are supporting organizations to build a breach resilience framework?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go for it. Because there's like we've 10 steps that we want to walk through, obviously. And look, there's multiple different ways that you can do. You can try build a breach resilience framework. The one we're going to go through is our preferred method. It does kick off, Conor, like around the whole business objectives piece, right? So
yeah, and I mean, if you're starting on that road towards what we're terming breach resilience, like how do you actually get going? Like where do you actually start?
Yeah, so look, we've this whole adage that we used to always say is like, you can't protect what you don't understand, right? And you kind of live and breathe it. I would say any information security training I've done since my start of my career is around information security is there to support strategic objectives or business objectives. So where I want to actually pick it up is prior to us actually going down on this journey, we as security or privacy professionals or IT professionals have a really, really clear understanding of what the business is trying to achieve, right? Because misplacing our focus without knowing what the intended goal or outcome of the business would be very, very naive. There's going to be a variety of different wants across different senior stakeholders or shareholders or the board or whatever it is. So I really, really emphasize, like, regardless of what if you're the CISO or the data protection officer going in this route, we in no uncertain terms are always, siloed in our thinking at times. So understanding the entirety of what that business is trying to achieve is a very powerful message.
And that's really interesting because the business objectives have to be front and center, right? Like you need to maintain, if you think of management's objectives in an organization, it's to maximize revenue, create a sustaining, self-fulfilling, and propagating organization that grows, right, and sustains and thrives over time. And that's what corporate strategy ultimately is. How can we grow new markets? How can we expand the current market? How can we continue to innovate and stay relevant? One of the best ways to do
corporate social responsibility stuff may be very, very linked to what we're trying to achieve here. I believe there's going to be a variety of different objectives that we wouldn't have even thought of in our own domains that we're going to have to align our thinking going forward, so that every single activity that we're going to inevitably try to improve or drive has to be linked back or directly tied back to an objective. We need to be able to demonstrate the return on investment for doing X and Y, right? And that's for me, it's a defensible position. I use that term way too much in my life, but it's a defensible position. It's like if a regulator comes in or an auditor comes in and they're asking you a question, at all times you can explain why you're doing something because it's directly tied back to an objective that could be driven by a variety of different factors. Yeah. So maybe let's kick into the ecosystem, Conor.
Yeah, because it's not just the business objectives, right? That's one aspect. That's very internally focused on where the business wants to go. But actually, the business doesn't exist in isolation. The business exists in this broader ecosystem and landscape. And that includes a number of different things. And understanding the business objective sets that internal agenda, but then looking outward, where does the business fit within the jurisdiction that it sits in and the different jurisdictions that it may operate within. But actually, it could be in a very particular industry. Financial services, for instance, are very highly regulated, and there's very high focus on requirements to do things in terms of diligence, in terms of fiduciary duties, and requirements to comply with transparency and customer obligations. And so all of those external requirements are also incredibly relevant for determining what you need to do in order to be resilient. And that resilience is going to be informed by the internal perspectives and those external perspectives. If you have a very highly regulated, a very highly high activity regulator making decisions and informing and issuing guidance, that ecosystem is going to be hugely important. As is the cultural and societal norms that might exist within the jurisdictions that you're supporting, and critically, as you've already identified, your customers' expectations, your external stakeholders, and that much broader landscape of objectives that may not necessarily be 100% core to your internal strategy, but ultimately will inform the guardrails within which you have to operate.
Yeah, I just think, Conor, you struck a thought with me there, because like if you're thinking about the style of organization or the industry or vertical that you're playing in, are you an operator of essential services? Like, do you actually as an organization pose a systemic risk to society, to the country that you're in, or the geography or wider environment? I also think it's critically important to look at your competitors in the market, because they may be, while you might be luckily enough, not be, I suppose, front and center for a potential attacker to target. Some of your competitors may be, or may have experienced in the past, maybe the last 24, 48 months have been hit in a certain way that you could learn from. Or you did mention this, I think, earlier when we were chatting, Conor, is like what's actually going on in the world right now, right? So we're currently seeing there are wars happening. That, and again, that shifts what's happening in the ecosystem, right? So I'll get into it a little bit more on the threat piece, but like it's very, very evident that the ecosystem for certain industries and certain geographies is changing and will continue to change over the next couple of years. It's a lot of speculation, right? With regards to things happening. We can only look back to some extent to see what's going to happen in the future, bar some very insightful people who are writing some great stuff out there.
But it's about awareness, right? So that context within which the organization operates is hugely important. The regulatory environment, the political landscape, the cultural and societal norms, and technology developments then as well, because that ecosystem also needs to include the landscape of technology that you have or that you could have, and the suppliers, etc., that are supporting you as well. And all of those potentially then give rise to threats within your environment. Isn't that right?
Yeah, for sure. So that's probably maybe a good juncture to kick into the threat landscape. Probably my favorite of the steps at the moment anyway. And really just to, so now we're at a point, right? I know what the business wants. I know what it's required to do. I have a very, very clear understanding about the industries and the ecosystem that we play in, right? So we're going in quite informed. And I actually think these are critically important for us before we even start thinking about threats, right? And first and foremost, funnily enough, luckily even my brain is in a good spot because I ran a threat workshop yesterday with one of my clients. Hopefully they're on the call. I won't reference them. But we went down the route of actually first off trying to identify, right, who are threat actors. So who potentially might be trying to attack us, and then what are our threats? Now you can go down a rabbit hole here, right? So I think there has to be some prerequisites agreed before you get down that process. So what did I do in this scenario? So I'll actually give it a real life. So luckily, one of our directors, Conor, Stephen Bowes, he, as part of his role, he regularly compiles and keeps it up to date with a large repository of threat reports. So I think he's about 70 odd currently in the 2023 folder, and he's starting to fill the 24 one now. I read through, I would say, the large portion of those over a period of time, specifically for a client, with a viewpoint of actually tailoring and picking out all of the specific elements for that ecosystem relating to the business objectives that I was aware of, and actually making a summarized version of the variety of different threats that are out there. Some sources like, say, ENISA, and I always like the ENISA report. So if anyone's not familiar, it's a European agency that is put in place to determine annually in retrospect what the key threats are within the European geography. Now, regardless of the threats and those threat reports, we embarked on a kind of a threat actor identification. I find this quite challenging, right? I'll tell you why. So one of the sources we use regularly is MITRE and MITRE groups. And there's about 140, if I remember correctly, threat groups that are up there. So historically well-known groups which have made successful attacks across a wide variety of industries. So we've compiled that obviously into an Excel. It's filterable right now. So I would have then agreed specific criteria for the business I was working for. So I would look at, right, where do they play? How are they classified? How are they seen by the market? Are they well known? Are they government? Are they private sector? Are they finance? Whatever it might be. And we filtered first off through all the MITRE groups. So I kind of whittled it down to about 12. And during the threat workshop, then we really did a bit of a deep dive, Q&A, rebuttals, going back and forth to each other to figure it out. And we got it down to about 3 or 4 where we felt, do you know what? These are potential groups that might try to attack us. And it was based on pretty solid information, right? Separately, the thing that kind of blew my mind when I went through all these other threat reports is that not one of the threat actors corresponded to any of the threat groups that were in the MITRE listing. So I inevitably had a call with one of our senior pen testers on Wednesday to kind of go through that specific point. And he did smartly raise that MITRE tends to be a little bit about a year behind. And also, as you might see from specific threat reports, effectively, a lot of these groups are given different names by different people. So we got our list down to about, I think it was 5 or 6 threat actors. And then we went down the threat route. And again, we had a pre-agreed thing where we want to do the top 5 threats. We want to have current threats, but also we had a space for emerging threats that might come out, right? So by actually going through and summarizing and figuring out and filtering through all these reports, we then sat down together, went through it all in detail, and very much started with a high list. Smartly, then what we did is we looked back at all the incidents that had happened in that organization over the last 24 months, which gave us a really clear insight into how to prioritize which of those threats from 1 to 5 made most sense for that business. So I found that to be extremely powerful as a participant in that workshop, and it was extremely defensible. There was
focusing on threats is a huge element in this framework, right? Because number one, we've taken into consideration the business objectives of the organization. Where do we want to go? Number two, we've looked at that ecosystem and external threat landscape that in which the organization actually lives. And number three, now we're looking to see, well, what represents a threat in terms of a potential vulnerability that we might have, and critically, who might be out there as an adversary that could attack us or could exploit something to cause us a problem. And part of that threat landscape, or rather one of the elements of that detailed threat landscape development, is you now have an informed position against which you can map all of your information assets and determine that threat-based assessment, right? And for me, that's one of the most powerful approaches in cybersecurity, in risk management today. Not just taking that risk-based approach, but adopting a threat assessment-led approach, actually basing it in fact. What challenges are organizations facing today? What do we know from all of the research that's being compiled day in, day out? And what intelligence can we gather? And then how can we build something to determine what we need to do, right? And because the next step, once we've determined that threat landscape and we've mapped all of the information assets against that, then ultimately we need to see, well, to what extent do we have controls that are going to mitigate those, mitigate the threats from materializing, or what else do we need to do, right? Because that's sacrosanct in terms of setting out the strategic direction of where we're going to go for breach resilience.
Yeah, and again, it's even in that asset mapping part, I won't labor on it. It's like basically you have a scope, you'll determine what you're trying to protect. You will map those specific threats to those assets. You know what threats might affect what assets. Then, to your point, Conor, leading you into the actual current state determination. So what we're trying to achieve here, and again, you can be very selective on what control framework you might want to use. We have some preferred ones, which I can go through. But ultimately, what we're trying to find out is how good or not is your organization at defending itself against a specific top threat relating to the asset that you're trying to protect. So you're validating your threat mitigation capability. So it will really, really determine how good you are. It's very powerful to go up to a board member. You know, if you get door stopped in a lift and they're like, well, I heard about ransomware on the radio. Okay, well, actually, that's number 4 in our top priority. And we know we're X good at defending or not, right? So again, Conor, there's a wide variety of NIST standards and CIS and different ones. Our preferred one for this engagement specifically is the NIST 853 revision 5. It's a special publication, but because it's actually mapped to NIST CSF. So why we use that specifically is because it's granular enough to get the, you know, deep dive into how good or not we are at defending, but also then I can kill 2 birds with 1 stone and actually determine as well a cybersecurity or breach resilience maturity score against, you know, govern, identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, or an equivalent. Okay, so that's really powerful. Again, going back to you, right? This is like a current state analysis of where we currently are.
And critically, it's based in fact, right? It's the reality of the threat landscape, the commercial objectives, and that external ecosystem. And so knowing where we are, as you said, it's such a hugely powerful message to be able to relay to senior management and indeed then to the entire organization that we know where we are, we know what threats are out there, and we know what our current state determination is. But then the best thing in one of the priority activities in this framework and how we have approached it, Stephen, is that we don't just look at how we are today, we also look at where we want to get to, because it needs to be a continuous improvement exercise. And that can only happen if you benchmark yourself where you are today in current state and build towards a target. And that target state, the future state, needs to be determined, and the business informs that. That's a discussion, a determination.
Goes back to the objectives, Conor. Like it straight goes back to the objectives. It loops back to stage 1, because like again, you can be easy to be misguided in where you want to be in the future, right? So if you're, I don't know, like if you're a top tier data center, your physical security, you might want it to be level 5 in a maturity score. But if you're I don't know, if you have a brochureware website and you're trying to get that to a level 5 security, what's the point? It's misguided. So again, flow back to your objectives, and that should support your understanding of where you need to be. And I actually think over time, Conor, anyway, right? You might want to be somewhere in 12 months. You might want to be somewhere in 3 years. So I think you can also do a staggered future desired state here, right?
Precisely. And that's the strategic element that we're talking about here, right? Ultimately, you need to strategically build resilience. It's not going to happen overnight. So knowing where you are today, and if I was to put it bluntly, knowing where you are today is important. Knowing where you want to get to is as important. But then knowing how to get there is the golden sauce, or the secret sauce, because that roadmap. And there's a question here that's been asked. Peter Baird has asked, what was the document reference again? That was NIST 853, the special publication, revision 5.
Revision 5.
I'll put it into the chat here for everybody. That, for instance, allows us to be able to determine the maturity assessment of today and the ambition that we might have in terms of our capabilities, defense, detection, defense, responding, recovering, and getting back up and running. That's what we're talking about here, is resilience. And
just conscious of time, Conor, actually, right? Thinking about, because we want to leave some time for Q&A, right? And we want to
absolutely.
There's a few things, there's a few more steps actually that we want to go through, but suggesting you're spot on in what you're saying about the strategic roadmap. That comes out of the current state analysis, right? And it's very much like managed like a project going forward then. So you have to figure out, you know where you want to be, you know where you are, you know your gaps from doing all your threat mitigation assessment and cyber resilience posture. So that is your roadmap, and that has to be owners, deadlines, priority, everything like that. Then it's moving on to how do you get the buy-in? And that's going to be around, I suppose, transparency, communication. It's all well and good doing all this in isolation. It's not going to serve you well. You need to now gain that senior leadership buy-in. I would argue you should have done this actually when you were determining business objectives, okay? But you're communicating the results. It'd be probably naive again if you didn't have senior stakeholders involved in the future determination. So I think there is this kind of, you need to be very cute about how you approach all of this throughout each of the steps.
Well, fundamentally, all of this is aligned to business objectives, right? And
Yeah.
that's why it's the first step. Aligning, it's not just aligning them, it's actually understanding them and then making sure that the current state determination highlights where we are in terms of enabling and supporting those commercial and business objectives, and how then we can continue to support and enable, subject to the continued management support and buy-in, the investment, the budgets and the resources that are going to be made available to us in order to execute that strategic roadmap and achieve that future state determination.
Think about Conor as well, right? So I now know where I want to be, I know where I am, and I know what objective it's tied to, or regulation, or whatever it might be. It specifically directs you where to place your focus, and focus around budget determination, focuses around resource allocation. Okay. And it's kind of, I think from the CISO or data protection officer or compliance functions perspective, there's an element of CYA, okay, that has to come into play. Because like if you're doorstopped by, or if you've a breach or an incident and you're doorstopped by a regulator, you always want to be able to present a strategic view of how you've approached governance or your multi-tier defense or response capability. If you've outlined to the business that you are here, you need to be here, and here's all the things I need to do to get you from A to B, and the business doesn't buy into it from a budgetary or resourcing point of view, and you continually raise it and identify and highlight the risks associated with not doing it, right? That's a challenge, okay? But it's also it's very important for people in our style of roles to ensure that senior leadership is aware that you need to spend money to stay where you are every year, right? You can't just, if you don't extend your budget, you'll inevitably go backwards because the landscape is changing.
Conor, that's a really important message, because for me, these 10 steps aren't a once-off either, right? Is actually that it's something that becomes continuous and needs to be revalidated over time, because let's face it, the external landscape, or that threat landscape in point 3, the ecosystem in which you're operating, point 2, all of those continue to evolve and change, and you need to be able to react to that as well. So your future state determination may evolve as well. In fact, your current state will evolve through technology degradation and technology developments, or internal changes and the commercial focus of the organization and the strategy the business takes as well. So this isn't a once-off, and that's why it's a strategic approach to resilience. So what do we need to do today? And how do we get to where we want to go? And then how do we continually revalidate support and align that to where the business is continuing to choose to go, and to face the threats and the evolutions in the landscape that it faces as well.
Let's jump to the last slide, and just again, and we kind of labored on this, Conor, right, around the final thoughts. Okay, so you've kind of touched upon yours to some extent, but I think for me, like, so we've gone through all this, right, Grant? We've given you a framework. That's great. The execution of it is really difficult. But I feel, again, if you look at me and Conor, if we were working in a specific organization, and if I was off trying to do this on my own, I think it would just be ineffective. So I think building of allegiances throughout the life cycle of this strategic approach is critical, right? So I think you need to figure out at the get-go, who do you need to partner with to make this a success? Obviously, understanding the objectives will help you determine who that might be. But if you look across the second line of defense, these are the people who are validating that the controls are both designed and operating effectively. They're generally going to be your advocates here. Getting all this together, figuring all that out, doing a combined approach, and getting that senior leadership buy-in that for me is essential, right? And that's
Yeah.
kind of my final thoughts on that, Con.
No, for sure. And maybe just to re-emphasize that point as well, and that's great, but it can't be that once-off process. It has to be continuous. It has to be evolutionary. It has to be iterative in basis. Otherwise, you're not actually maintaining that resilience capability. It will go backwards, as you said, and you're not able to maintain and then evidence that digital trust going forward, which is such a hallmark now of competition and competitive advantage, and assurance requirements in the supply chain. You will eventually, at some point, sooner or later, be overtaken by that evolving threat landscape. And fundamentally, risk isn't one-dimensional. It's this constant balancing act and reprioritization, and that's required. So my key takeaway is that you need to live and breathe breach resilience, and that's the only true way that it can become a strategic enabler for your business. I see a question here, Stephen. I might just throw it to you because you were talking about budgets, right? Gavin has asked, what is your experience of security budgets for 2024? Are they increasing, reducing, stable, and what's driving that?
Yeah, I think budgets is a really tricky one to talk about. Really, look, I'll give you my spin on it. I think it varies from organization and industry, right? It's all but I'll flip that question to an extent. It goes back. I think you should be doing something like we've just outlined to help you determine and fight for a budget. You see in a lot of organizations is there's a predetermined budget depending on reporting line. Okay, there's predetermined budget, and someone just might want to spend it so they don't lose it, or people are, because they actually don't have a clear understanding of their current state, they're spending money or focusing their effort, resources, or money in areas that aren't providing a return on investment. So if you, again, going back to what we're trying to give you as a takeaway here is, if you do this, it empowers you to determine what budget you might need. You can stagger the plan over time because, like, again, if you break it down into your protection, your identification, your detection, response, or recovery, what's most important to you, right? So if a simple example, if you were in a PCI environment, I would argue availability, because it's not in the standard, is not a priority. So you're not going to be focusing on that area, but you will focus on potentially encryption or the security of the systems of where payment card data, ingress points, how it's processed, etc. But so for me, it's about you guys actually figuring that out through understanding where you currently stand or currently are placed maturity wise. Hopefully that's answered your question.
I think it's very interesting because, you picked one industry there. For instance, if I was to pick healthcare or operator of essential services, for instance, availability is going to be the priority, right? So it's going to come down to those risk-based determinations, but I think a hugely insightful answer there, Stephen. And in reality, that sort of brings us to a conclusion. And I think we'll hand back to you, Peter. Thank you so much to everybody for asking questions, and thank you for listening to us for the past 40 minutes.
Thanks very much. And look, if there's any other questions, we have a couple of minutes there. We're more than happy to take a few more. So yeah, appreciate your attendance.
Guys, that was terrific. I think the biggest reason I loved it, apart from your delivery, was how it aligned with my view of the world as well. So I'm like it, aren't I? I was writing lots of notes while you were speaking, particularly around the example of a threat workshop. And boy, that aligns with the way that I do those as well. And
Right.
If only everyone would, huh? But I had one point to make on the back of that. And when in practice, when we run threat workshops for our clients, we go through a very similar, if not identical, process. And then we recommend to clients that they consider following it up with what I've described as a desktop red team exercise, a thought process.
Yeah.
And we would take the output of a threat workshop and regularly meet with key stakeholders in the business and ask them to think about how their systems, processes, and people would respond to an example threat that we picked from that threat workshop.
I like that, actually. I really
I
do.
like it too because it's a lot less effort than going on site and breaking into buildings and
Yeah,
things.
yeah.
But you know, what we would do is we would play the bad guys,
Yeah.
and it would be an interaction, a verbal interaction between the red team and the blue team, in effect,
Yeah.
but purely around a board table, and it seems to really stimulate thinking. And allows the business to potentially focus on the things that are a proper return on investment. That key point you made at the end there.
I actually think as well to kind of just delve into that a touch. I even the framework we went through and all these threat workshops, right? I could argue that we're even missing a step in our framework to an extent, right? Obviously, there's only so many things you can outline in a webinar. But another area we suggest is that continuity, depending on your organization, right? If you're going down the BIA route, it probably should be done before all of this. Because if you can consider within a business, you want to know what your key critical business processes are. In some respects, I think we're basing what we've gone through today on the fact that an assumed basis that you've an operating BCP and BIAs are done, right? And you have a really, really clear understanding about what your key critical business processes are. So
Yeah.
each one of those threats and threat scenarios then will funnel back into your continuity program, right? Because how do you do instant response anyway, first off, or scenario based if you haven't pre-done your continuity journey? I love the fact that a red teaming piece, or purple teaming or blue teaming, whatever way we want to do it, because you're going to validate actually is your priority list correct. So again, it's further defensible position as to why you selected these.
Yeah. Well, hey audience, look, these guys really know what they're talking about. I'm just so impressed with today, and I really hope that the audience today do choose to engage with you further. And you'll see the poll quiz thing popped up at the moment. Do tick that yes please under learning more, because honestly, I have never heard as good a presentation of the way that businesses should address business resilience based on technical resilience. It's terrific. Well done, guys.
Great. Yeah. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Peter.
If we've time, there's one more question there from Terry Minford. It said, how do you best map out the plan to move from the current state and the desired future state? I'm happy I'll tackle that if you want, Con. Like I look, so let's say you figure out how good or not you are at defending, right? And you have your posture maturity. I think it boils down to then the resourcing element and the budgetary elements. But again, going back to what we stated earlier, every single one of those tactical steps, you should treat them as treatment plans. Okay. And this is my kind of final thought on this, right? And I use this specifically in one of my clients, and I find it very beneficial. You should not work on anything that doesn't mitigate risk.
Yeah.
And if you keep that mentality in your head, why am I doing this? And I actually think each treatment plan or tactical step in a strategy has to be specifically mapped in as a treatment plan in your risk register.
Yeah.
It has to tie back to a specific threat, to a specific asset. And then you could then look at, right, well, how much you might have a control in place, and then you get into the quantification of risk. Fine. So let's say it's on a 5 scale, and I get, okay, this is 3 out of 5 on this. You still have a treatment plan that might get you to a 4, but only if the future desired state requires it. And then that focuses how you drive your plan. Because ultimately, you cannot know that unless you've quantified how good the design is and how well it's operating, right? So you can go down rabbit holes on this, but once you've done that treatment, obviously standard operating procedure would bring you back to potentially upgrading or adding a control, and then reassessing your residual score, right? So I see it has to be structured.
And that's the auditor coming out in you, Stephen, right?
I know.
Because
Sorry, yeah.
but fundamentally, we're talking about threat assessments, we're talking about control remediation. So building that plan needs to be grounded in something. It's in the backdrop of the strategic objectives of the organization, but you don't have limited resources. We're assuming you don't, right? And there's a couple of assumptions here in fairness, right? We're assuming the BIA, we're assuming, you know, risk management is a competency. But fundamentally, you don't have limited resources, so you need to be able to prioritize and linking what you're doing in terms of remediation steps and the improvement of capabilities that you want to achieve. If they're not linked, as you said, Scotty, to the strategic objectives, you have to ask yourself that question. Why are we doing this?
So we're on the hour. We're on the hour. We could talk for. I'll be honest. I think we could.
Yeah, I would vote for another hour, but I'm afraid we're pretty much out of time.
We might do a sequel. We might do a sequel, right? You know. So
I've enjoyed that webinar more than many for a long time. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
And I'm sure the audience agree. I've seen lots of applause floating up the screen there. Just a final big thank you for today's webinar. I hope we get to hear more from you on related topics and taking this forward. And a big thank you to our audience today, who obviously really enjoyed it and asked lots of interesting questions and made appropriate observations. And of course, a big thank you to Declan for making it all happen on a technical front. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, I really enjoyed
Thanks,
it.
everybody.
We'll see you soon. See you on the next webinar.
Absolutely. Take care. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.